We're a general firm of architects, we've always said, and we work on both new build and some existing buildings. And we've built up over the last few years quite a lot of refurbishment work, all exclusively within the non-domestic sector. So none of this is domestic work. And I appreciate that is probably the biggest challenge that we actually have as a nation. But what we find, in contrast to new building types that we do, the refurbishment area or the reuse area, virtually every project is unique, and it is much, much more difficult to apply rules to that. So what I'm going to try and just go through a small number of projects and just run through some of the challenges, but particularly the drivers and also some of the opportunities for those projects. And they're mostly office buildings in nature. The first one is this, which is our own office in Clerkenwell in London, before we refurbished it, I hasten to add. This one really, the great driver behind this one is it's a derelict barn, literally a derelict barn in Clerkenwell, and we bought it at a time when there was a huge, the first .com boom, if you like, and we just couldn't afford to rent in Clerkenwell. As we were being kicked out of the offices that we were in. Bizarrely, we found we could afford to buy, but we couldn't afford to rent. And so we began looking at this, and what we've been looking at, ideally, was huge open plan workspaces, BCO compliant type office space. And beginning to look at this, it's one of the first proper refurbishments that we did. It began to make us look at things very, very differently, because we were having to deal with what was there, and it already existed. Now, this is the office as it is today. It's a whole series of different types of buildings. And if you apply things like BCO to it, the building's a catastrophe. But everybody who walks around it says, what a wonderful place to work. So it makes you wonder which one of those is right. And I think it probably brings into question BCO rather than it does the suitability of the office. And it's made us look at a whole set of different building types. From a refurbished barn, a 17th century barn, a 1950s industrial building, and some small elements of new build and a Georgian house, all of which become a series of very rich spaces that we move around now. And it's very, very enjoyable, and it's probably more enjoyable than it would have been if it was just the kind of place that we were actually looking for. And it's very, very straightforward. We did do some work a few years ago with Oxford University looking at libraries, and we found out that generally the older a library was, the less energy it used, and the newer it was, and the more energy efficiency measures there were in it, generally the more energy it used. And we then started looking at a series of office buildings. This happens to be for Hampshire County Council, and it was done in the late noughties. This was a 1960s building. And we found that 1960s buildings, while they're sort of archetypal, hideous modern buildings, they're often actually quite easy to deal with, because they're usually shallow plan. They've usually got quite heavy reinforced concrete in situ structure. They do have precast that's falling off them. But that's actually quite easy to deal with. Now, in this case, Hampshire had built this building in the centre of Winchester for themselves in the 60s, and it was part of their legacy, and they wanted to deal with it. The other key driver, it's in the centre of the city, the other key driver was, by looking at the building afresh, we could make that building a lot more efficient. And so the number of people who are now based in this building is over double what it had been before we started, but the actual building isn't a great deal larger in size. It fits into the townscape a great deal better. And environmentally, we were able to bring the energy consumption down to about 25% of what it had been previously. Also, the timing for building it was quite significantly shorter. The actual construction cost per square metre isn't substantially less than a new build, but the time taken to do it, so the prelims in particular, was substantially smaller, and the structure was still there. Environmentally, it also drove things that we wouldn't normally look at. It has quite compressed floor to ceiling heights, which meant we had a binary choice between natural ventilation and four-pipe fan coils. There wasn't that sort of intermediate low-energy mechanical systems that we could look at. So it's a case of an existing building driving something that's more innovative and more interesting than would have been the case had it been new build. In this case, the building is surrounded on three sides by quite heavily trafficked roads, so we couldn't rely on cross-ventilation. So we ended up developing a system. This is actually using wind rather than stack effect. The diagram looks like stack effect, but it's not. It's driven by wind flowing across the top of the building. coming from the courtyards in the centre, using wind tunnel testing, and applying a series of chimneys onto the outside of the building, which also played a key townscape role. Now, this is the building once it had been stripped back, and you look at that and you think, yeah, is it really worth actually keeping the building? There doesn't appear to be a great deal of that building left there, but in actual fact, in embodied energy terms, there's about 60% of the building that's still there. That most of the embodied energy, or a substantial portion of it, is in the sub and superstructure of the building, so it is definitely still worth keeping. By exposing the concrete, we could expose the thermal mass and use natural ventilation. These are before and after shots of the building, where we've been trying to fit more into the townscape of Winchester, and some of the more distant shots in the courtyards around the building. This is the building as it was, and one of the ones, I think it's the one on the lower right-hand side, is more or less exactly the same position within the reused building, where then the structure is exposed, simply painted, and the building has been reclad. And that, as I said, the energy consumption of that came down quite significantly. But the most significant thing was getting a lot more people into a refurbished building, which enabled the council to release leases elsewhere in the town. This is, in a way, one of the most unglamorous projects to start with that I think we've ever had. This is in Elgin in North East Scotland, and this was a redundant supermarket on the edge of the town centre. The council, again for economic reasons, was looking to consolidate onto one site. It couldn't be seen to build a big new gleaming office building for itself, and this building was there. So we were asked to look at it as a feasibility study. Was there a way that you could fit council offices into a redundant supermarket? You'd assume the answer is no, but in actual fact we found it could, and it became quite an exciting space. And we began looking at particularly Silicon Valley and the large open plan spaces that many of those have, with just a series of pods placed into a large room. And actually, once you strip back all of the ceilings, where it was a fairly standard supermarket height space, and put a few skylights in, we got a very deep plan, single story, very well lit building. And again, the energy consumption of that is significantly lower than the buildings that Moray Council were moving out of. And I hope some really quite enjoyable spaces within that as well. Then there are more beautiful cases where the primary driver for refurbishing the buildings is cultural. And in this case, this is the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-on-Avon. It was simultaneously at one end of the building, it was said to be the best place in the world to watch Shakespeare, and in the main auditorium, the worst. It's a 1930s listed Art Deco theatre. It was hugely vacuous auditorium. So the exercise was to refurbish and retain the building as was, but to insert a new and much more intimate auditorium into that. Well, obviously in this case the emphasis is on the auditorium, the performance in the centre of the building. But as we begin sort of stripping the building back, particularly visible on the slide on the right, is just leaving remnants of the building there and memories within it, and just that revealing of history and unlayering the building, which I think has a hugely important cultural side to the reuse of buildings, and as remembering where we've come from, where we're going to, etc. And it just makes buildings more enjoyable. I think we've found that we increasingly just enjoy the differences and the richness and almost the picturesqueness that comes from reusing existing buildings. And this is part of the skyline looking over Stratford-upon-Avon. And really that process of revealing and stripping back buildings has been particularly a strong point for us within largely cultural buildings. I mean, there's a series of them here. The Chester Theatre on the bottom left-hand corner is one that we're engaged with at the moment, and the Old Vic at the top. But then the other end of the scale is really the reuse of, if you like, late 20th century office buildings, and that's been there are typologies beginning to emerge, and this ranges from the top left-hand one, which is a late 1940s, early 1950s, quite heavy building, the former Unison headquarters on Euston Road in London, which is 1970s, again actually quite heavy structure, and we found those, as said previously, quite relatively easy to deal with. The bottom diagram is for a building in Bexley, which is a hugely deep plan steel 1980s buildings, and those have been by far the most difficult to deal with. And I think there comes a point where it is questionable whether or not those can be reused very efficiently or not. In two of these cases, these were part of the low carbon workplace funded by Threadneedle, and there was a desire to look at the rental market, the speculative market, and begin looking at how we can do low energy refurbishments that keep most of the embodied energy within the buildings. And again, with Bexley, similar to Hampshire County Council, that's about consolidation really, and using one building to contain vastly more people, and to reduce energy costs in particular. And then I think the final project that I'm just going to come on to is, again, this is a mixture of different project types. This is at King's Cross. It's actually the original King's Cross station, the Midlands Goods Shed, before the main Cubit shed that we know today was built. A curving Victorian structure, and in this case it was looking at putting a members' public facility for the Guardian newspaper, and a supermarket and cookery school for Waitrose into this a series of buildings. And again, they're all different ages and different types of buildings, particularly with the curving, the original train station on the left-hand side of the right-hand slide. And in this case, again, it was about just stripping the building back, exposing what was there, and trying to improve the fabric and performance of the building, but equally not throwing away what had been there. And I think one of the consequences of that general approach around the King's Cross Master Plan has been that there's just a little bit more historic fabric around the place, and compared to many of the other large redevelopments in central London, King's Cross just has a little bit more of well, as I said, ambience, a little bit of patina to it, and it feels a little bit more rooted than the places where we just start with a complete tabula rasa and build everything anew. And the buildings perform at least as well, and particularly the embodied carbon is significantly reduced in all of these buildings. And then this is just as a final slide, it's just some of the collection of buildings really over the last few years from Royal Shakespeare Theatre, Moray and Hampshire County Councils, and then the Hammersmith Grove and our own office at the top there. So I will just leave you with those images. Thank you very much.